I clearly remember the moment we first learned about it. It wasn't an aircraft in the traditional sense that we Allied pilots and sailors knew. It was something that defied the logic of aerial warfare. In late 1944 and early 1945, as the tide of war in the Pacific turned decisively in our favor, Japan resorted to weapons that transcended desperation. And the Yokosuka MXY-7 Oka, affectionately, or rather ironically, nicknamed by us Cow, which in Japanese means idiot, was the embodiment of this despair, transforming into a very real terror. In fact, for many of us, it was more feared than any conventional fighter or bomber, and I'll explain why. Our first official and devastating encounter with the Oka occurred during the Okinawa operations. It was a baptism of fire that marked the fleet. Before that, we had heard rumors, fragmented reconnaissance reports, intelligence stories about a manned flying bomb being dropped from a larger bomber. We had seen the mother aircraft, usually the slow and robust Mitsubishi G4M, which we nicknamed Betty, carrying something strange under their bellies. Something that looked like a torpedo with tiny wings and a cockpit. But nothing prepared us for the reality of its speed and destructive payload. The first significant attack that became widely known and deeply shocked the Pacific Fleet was the one that hit the USS Domestic. The date for me is engraved, April 12, 1945. On that day, the crew of the Domestic, an escort destroyer, witnessed in terror the approach of an Oka. Its speed was incredible. Witnesses spoke of something coming from the sky, like a meteor. The gunners barely had time to lock their guns on the target before it was upon them. The flying missile struck the Domestic with the force of over a ton of explosives, vaporizing the bow section and sinking it almost instantly. It was a surgical, swift, and lethal strike that demonstrated the Oka's ability to penetrate defenses on its final dive. From that moment on, he stopped being a curiosity and became a high-priority threat. Intelligence finally began to piece together what we were facing. It wasn't a paper airplane, as some jokers initially called it, referring to its lightness and simplified construction. It was, in fact, a human-guided ballistic missile, powered by solid-fuel rockets designed to negate the laws of ballistics and the human factor in anti-aircraft defenses. The Oka's top speed, some reports estimated at over 600 miles per hour in a dive, made interception in the final stage virtually impossible for the anti-aircraft guns of the time. We had excellent gunners, but physics was against us when this weapon entered its terminal dive. It was a tactical nightmare. You had to shoot down the mother aircraft before that it would come within launch range, or face the consequences of having a 1-ton projectile, with a determined kamikaze pilot at the controls, heading for your ship. This was the new and terrifying reality of war that the Baka imposed on us. To really understand the Oka, the cherry blossom, the poetic Japanese nickname that contrasts so sharply with our Baka, we need to return to its birth, which took place not in conventional engineering laboratories, but in the mind of a young and idealistic officer. The story of this weapon is not just about metal, wood, and explosives. It is about doctrine, kamikaze, and total dedication to sacrifice. The man behind the initial concept was Ensign Mitsuo Ota. Wasn't a career aircraft designer, but a transport pilot. This is an irony that has always struck me. A pilot who normally focused on getting cargo from point A to point B became the father of one of the most extreme weapons in history. By mid-1944, the situation in the Pacific was deteriorating rapidly for Japan. Our fleets were advancing. New American fighters like the Hellcat and Corsair were decimating Japanese squadrons, and worse for them, experienced pilots were burning out. Ota realized that the traditional approach to aerial combat was failing. Dive attacks and torpedo attacks were easily intercepted by our squadron of Combat Air Patrol, SEAP fighters, and the anti-aircraft artillery we were perfecting every day. What was needed, in his view, was an unstoppable weapon, something that would ignore defenses and guarantee destruction. Ota's idea was simple in its brutality: eliminate the chance of human error at the crucial moment of attack. Instead of a bomb or torpedo that could be diverted by a ship's evasive maneuver or exploded before reaching its target, he proposed a manned missile. Ota's plan was essentially to place the heaviest possible explosive charge in a lightweight airframe, add a rocket propulsion system for top speed and a pilot for precision. He presented his sketches, drawn on plain paper perhaps, hence, ironically, the nickname Paper Airplane, to technicians at the Yokosuka Naval Air Technical Arsenal, Kugisho, in August 1944. The Imperial Japanese Navy, already embracing the kamikaze philosophy as a tactic of last resort, saw in Ota's concept the answer they were looking for. It wasn't a plane for fighting, but a projectile for to guarantee the collision. The development was vertiginous. By September, prototypes were already in production. The urgency of war and the philosophy of sacrifice allowed the Oka to skip many of the rigorous testing phases that a normal aircraft would go through. Instead of worrying about long-term maintenance, fuel economy, or landing maneuvers, which were completely non-existent in the operational model, engineers focused on two things: terminal velocity and tow explosive load capacity, and in this they were terribly successful. The Oka, officially designated the MXY-7, was not just a new type of weapon. It was the crystallization of the kamikaze doctrine into an engineering platform, ready to be unleashed upon us. This swift and enthusiastic acceptance by the Japanese leadership showed us that they were willing to take the concept of total war to a level we Westerners could barely comprehend. If part 2 was about the idea, this one is about the execution. Oka Model 11, the operational version that caused us so much dread, is a case study in minimalist and brutal military design. When I called it a paper airplane, I wasn't far from the truth regarding the construction philosophy dictated by Japan's urgency and resource scarcity at the end of the war. Japanese engineers needed something that could be assembled quickly, using a minimum of strategic materials, and most importantly, that could perform a single mission with maximum effectiveness. The result was a surprisingly small fuselage, only about 6 meters long and a wingspan of just over 5 meters. The construction was predominantly of wood, with aluminum and steel alloy parts used only where structural integrity was critical, such as in the main wing spars and around the pilot and engine compartments. This allowed production to be decentralized and rapid, utilizing small workshops and less specialized labor, sparing aluminum and other strategic metals for the construction of conventional combat aircraft. This reliance on non-strategic materials contributed greatly to our initial disdain before we understood the weapon's power. The Oka's aerodynamics was simple, with straight wings and a twin-tail configuration that gave it stability but not maneuverability. It was not designed to fly well, but yes, top-lane efficiently from the parent aircraft. This glide phase was crucial. After being released from the Mitsubishi Betty, the pilot had to navigate the Oka silently for a brief period, taking advantage of the altitude gained by the parent aircraft. Control surfaces were minimal, as there was no need for complex combat maneuvers. The only critical maneuver was the terminal dive, but what truly defined the Model 11's engineering was its heart, the combination of warhead and propulsion. The nose housed a massive warhead of 200 kilo, 2,746 lbs, usually filled with the explosive known as ammonal. This was larger than the warhead of any standard Japanese aerial torpedo or dive bomb we were accustomed to facing, and was positioned to ensure armor penetration before detonation. In the tail were 3 solid-fuel rocket engines Type 4, Mark I, Model 20. They were simple, reliable, and together they provided tremendous thrust, but only for about 8 to 10 seconds. This burst of power, reserved for the final stage of the dive, was what transformed the simple glider into the supersonic missile that terrified us. The simplicity and brutality of this design are a testament to its unique mission effectiveness. Herein lies the tragic irony, from our perspective, but the salvation for many Allied sailors. The great tactical flaw and Achilles' heel of the Oka was not the missile itself, but the aircraft designed to carry it, the medium bomber, Mitsubishi G4M, which we nicknamed Betty. For the Oka to be effective, it needed to be brought as close to our target as possible. Its short range, only about 37 kilometers, 23 miles, after launch, the mother aircraft had to penetrate our radar defenses and combat air patrol, CAP, before releasing the cherry blossom. And this is where the Betty failed miserably. The G4M was known for its ruggedness and long range, but it had a terrible reputation among our fighter pilots, who called it a flying lighter or a rubber bullet due to its weak armor and, most critically, the lack of self-sealing fuel tanks. A single 50 caliber, 12.7mm machine gun round from a Hellcat or Corsair could spectacularly set it ablaze. Imagine the scene. An already notoriously vulnerable bomber was now flying slower and at lower altitudes than normal, because it was carrying an extra weight of over 2 tons, the Oka and its warhead, under its fuselage. This load made the Betty even slower and less maneuverable. They became easy prey, priority targets, and we knew that if we could shoot down the Betty, we would eliminate not only the mother aircraft and its crew, but also the kamikaze bomb it carried. Our intelligence quickly focused on identifying Betty formations that appeared to be carrying something unusual and treated them with the utmost urgency. Oka's first major operational mission, the attack of the Jinrai Squad, Divine Thunder, on March 21, 1945, illustrated this failure catastrophically for the Japanese. A group of 16 Bettys, each carrying an Oka, was intercepted by American F-6F Hellcat fighters well before reaching the intended drop zone. The result was devastating. All 16 Betty bombers were shot down before they could release their Okas. Not a single cherry blossom hit its target. This disaster showed the Japanese that their tactic was flawed, but instead of abandoning it, they doubled down on the sacrifice, seeking new ways to bring the weapon closer to us. For the Allied Navy, however, the Betty's vulnerability became our first and most effective line of defense against the Baka. When my teammates and I were trying to understand the mind of a pilot kamikaze, the word that came to mind was fanaticism. But the reality behind the young people who volunteered to pilot the Oka was much more complex and, in some ways, even more frightening. They weren't just pilots. They were often young university students who were taken from their classrooms and forced into a war for which they had not been trained. Choosing pilots for the Oka and other kamikaze units was seen as an honor, a chance to die like a cherry blossom, a metaphor I never fully understood. However, the process was anything but voluntary in the Western sense of the word. Under the intense pressure of Japanese militarism and the Bushido, the opportunity to sacrifice oneself for the emperor and the nation was presented in such a way that refusal was unthinkable. Seen as a betrayal of one's family and country, Oka training was remarkably short and focused solely on the final task. To simulate the experience of gliding, they had Oka K1, the training version. The K1 was essentially the Model 11 airframe, but with the weight of the warhead and rockets replaced by water ballast and, crucially, equipped with a wooden landing gear, ski and flaps ailerons. The ballast was released before landing. The pilot was taken into the air and released, learning to control the aircraft in a dive and land it, a maneuver he would never perform in a real plane. The K1 was notoriously difficult to pilot. Even without the weight of the warhead, it was aerodynamically awkward and reached a dangerously high landing speed, about 130 mph or 209 km/h, making each training flight a test of courage in itself. The irony was palpable. The pilots who survived the most difficult training would face a final mission where there would be no landing. Training focused on approach, controlling dive speed, and finally adjusting the aim to ensure impact. The philosophy was clear. The pilot was merely the precision piece needed to transform a heavy bomb into a perfectly aimed, high-speed projectile. The cockpit of the operational Oka was Spartan. No parachute, no defensive armament, just the pilot, the controls, and the vision of death ahead, a veritable death capsule designed to ensure an ending. The psychological preparation was intensive, permeated by honor rituals, farewell ceremonies, and the belief that their sacrifice would ensure Japan's salvation. For us on the receiving end, this ruthless determination was what made the Baka such a terrifying enemy. Of all her brutal features, what made the Oka truly terrifying to us sailors and gunners was her terminal velocity. It wasn't just quick, it was, for brief moments, almost unstoppable by the anti-aircraft defenses of the time. Remember, the Oka was not a propeller-driven plane or a glider. It was essentially orange ballistic missile and a pilot for final guidance. The most dangerous phase of their attack began when the pilot sighted the target and, after an initial gliding period, activated the 3 solid-fuel rocket engines all at once or in rapid sequence. When these rockets ignited, the acceleration was dizzying. In a steep dive, the Oka Model 11 could reach speeds that comfortably exceeded 600 miles per hour, about 960 km/h, and some Allied estimates suggested that it could soon approach Mach 0.8, depending on the launch altitude. In practical terms, this meant the aircraft was flying at a speed at which its own wood and aluminum fuselage could barely withstand the aerodynamic stress. This speed was far higher than that of any dive bomber we had encountered and rivaled the maximum diving speed of our fastest fighters. And why did it matter so much? Reaction time. Our standard defense of ships against kamikaze aircraft was based on layers: the most distant CAP, fighter air patrol; the long-range defenses, 5-inch guns; and finally, the fast-firing 40 milli and 20 milli anti-aircraft artillery, the famous Beaufort and Oerlikons. Against a conventional aircraft, we had precious seconds. Against the Oka, reaction time shrank to less than 10 seconds between the moment it fired its rockets and impact. Our slower targeting systems, which used radar-centered fire, could barely lock onto the target. When the mother aircraft released the Oka and it fired its rockets, its high-speed trajectory was a guided bullet that was nearly impossible to hit before contact. The only consolation, and it was cold consolation, was that the terminal velocity created so much stress on the Oka's airframe that piloting in the final stage was incredibly difficult, requiring nerves of steel and perfect aim from the doomed pilot. But when the aim was good, the combination of speed and the front 200-kilo warhead ensured that the impact would be catastrophic. The Oka wasn't just an attack. It was a ballistic event's haute terme. While Japanese propaganda elevated Oka pilots to the status of war gods, the stark numbers at the end of World War II tell a story of ineffective despair. The operational use of Oka was mainly concentrated during the Battle of Okinawa, April-June 1945. The goal was to deliver blows so massive and psychologically debilitating that they would force the Allies to reconsider invading the home islands. However, its impact was marginal in the context of the vast campaign and the enormous Allied fleet surrounding Okinawa. In summary, the aircraft we called Baka Bomb achieved the following results. Allied ships sunk. 3 USS Manert El Abel, DD-733, destroyer. USS Jeffers, DD-6-21, fast sweep destroyer. Note that the Jeffers was initially listed as sunk in some sources, but post-war analysis generally classifies her as irreparably damaged and removed from the fleet. But the explosion of an Oka near him is credited with causing heavy damage. To be more precise, the domestic was sunk, and the Jeffers was so damaged that it was subsequently decommissioned. Damaged Allied ships, including escort and transport ships, about 6 to 8, USS Achenar, aka 53. Cargo attack ship USS She DD-750. Destroyer USS Gaiety AM-239. Minesweeper. Other escort and transport ships suffered varying damage, while the sinking of any ship and the loss of sailors would be terrible tragedies for us. The total toll was militarily negligible, especially considering the cost to Japan, pilot losses. Each attack resulted in the loss of a kamikaze pilot, losses of mother aircraft. The highest cost was the catastrophic loss of the transport aircraft G4M Betty. On most missions, the Betty and its crew were shot down long before reaching the launch zone. And in the case of the Jinrai Squadron, tactical ineffectiveness, the Oka consistently failed in its primary purpose, sinking the most important Allied warships, such as aircraft carriers or battleships. The few times it came close, its armor or heavy firepower was sufficient to withstand the impact, as with the USS West Virginia, which suffered a near miss but was not sunk. Ultimately, despite being an impressive and terrifying technological development, the Oka was introduced too late, and the number of operational units actually launched against the fleet was too small. It became the symbol of a desperate and failed war effort, dependent on human sacrifice and a tactic that was quickly countered by Allied air superiority. The Oka Model 11's major flaw lay in its dependence on the slow and vulnerable bomber, Mitsubishi G4M. Ready to be transported, the Allies quickly learned to intercept and destroy the mothership at long ranges, rendering the Oka useless before it was even launched. The Imperial Japanese Navy attempted to remedy this flaw with a series of variant designs, notably the Oka Model 22. The jump to the jet, the Oka Model 22, represented the most significant development of the original concept, replacing the rocket engines with a rudimentary jet engine, the Thermojato Motor Tsu-11. This engine was not a modern turbojet, but rather a pulse jet similar to that used in the German V1s. But the Tsu-11 was a ducted engine type, which promised lower vulnerability. The jet engine, Thermojet, allowed for a much greater operational range than short-thrust rocket engines. This meant the mother plane could release the Oka from a greater distance from the target, beyond the immediate range of ship-based anti-aircraft defenses. Improved mother aircraft, it was planned to be carried by the twin-engine bomber Yokosuka P-1Y Ginga, France's. A faster and more robust aircraft than the old Betty. Unfortunately for Japan, unfortunately for us, Allies, production delays. Only about 50 units of the Model 22 were built. Production of the new Su-11 engine was extremely late, and most Model 22 airframes never received the engine. Not seen in combat, the Oka Model 22 never entered operational combat before the end of the war. The most radical projects, Oka 43. Japanese desperation led to even more radical designs that sought to eliminate the need for a mothership altogether, focusing instead on the defense of metropolitan Japan. Oka Model 43A KO submarine launch. Designed to be launched by a catapult installed on long-range submarines, such as the I-400, allowing surprise attacks close to the enemy coast, as in the planned attack on the Panama Canal, which never materialized. Oka Model 43B Otsu, cave launch. Designed to be launched from a rail-mounted catapult hidden within tunnels and caves on coastal slopes, this version was intended for the final defense of the homeland, launching the manned missile directly at the Allied invasion fleet, Operation Downfall. If it were to come to fruition, none of these projects reached the operational stage. The Oka remains in our memory as a vivid symbol of humanity's fanaticism and unregulated technological development. A weapon that was simultaneously brilliant in concept and flawed in its application. When the war ended in August 1945, hundreds of Okas, many still in shipping crates, others incomplete in underground factories, were captured by Allied forces. Japan never had the opportunity to use most of the 800-850 models that were manufactured. the fate of the surviving aircraft. The captured specimens had two main destinations. Undoing, the vast majority were scrapped and destroyed, as they no longer posed a threat and were seen as symbols of a defeated militaristic regime. Preservation for study and display. A limited number of aircraft were carefully preserved and sent to the US and UK for technical analysis. Today, these are the artifacts that tell the story. Model 11 in British museums. Several examples of the Model 11 captured in Okinawa are on display in important museums, such as the Imperial War Museum, IWM, and the Royal Air Force Museum, RAF Museum. Not the United Kingdom Model 22 in the USA. The only known example of the most advanced Oka Model 22 turbojet is on display at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum in the United States. Training version, the Oka MXY-7K1 two-seat training version with landing skis, is preserved in the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, highlighting the complexity of the training required. The Oka remains one of the darkest and most fascinating symbols of World War II, not only for its cutting-edge rocket and jet technology for the time, but primarily for being a weapon designed to kill its own pilot, a death capsule that encapsulated the despair and fanaticism of a nation on the brink of total defeat.